This is the Canon RF 100mm f2.8 macro lens, and I've been testing it out on the R6 to put it through its paces, see what it can do, see how it performs. Now, this is not a new lens. We did do a first look on this lens when it first was announced, but I've never had a proper chance to test it out, and I've been quite excited to do so because I actually love a good macro lens, not only for macro photos, but a good 100mm f2.8 actually gives you so many different opportunities for taking photos. You know, you can do portraits with that sort of thing, landscape, product photography. There's a lot that you can do with a nice 100mm fast aperture lens. But of course, it's also a macro lens, so it's able to get in nice and close. And actually this lens can do 1.4 times magnification. So we see a slight increase on previous Canon macro lenses, which is great. And I must say, it does feel, in terms of macro photography, like this gets in extremely close to your subject. There's a few interesting things about this lens. Obviously, you've got things you would expect from an RF lens, so things like the control ring at the end here, which can be used for different things like aperture or ISO, and you can customize that to an extent. But we see things like a spherical aberration control. Not something I would ever really expect to see, but it's an interesting thing to add in, and it does give you some options for how you want things to look. If you turn it to the left, you're going to get a slightly softening effect on your subject, and the background is going to become very, very soft. It also zooms out a little bit. If you turn it to the right, it's going to zoom in a little bit. And it's also going to give you that slight softening effect on your subject again, but this time the background is going to get much harsher. So the bokeh is going to appear much harsher if you turn it to the right than if you turn it to the left. And of course, if you just leave it in the middle, it sort of does click and hold in place a little bit. It will just be normal. That's the kind of standard setting. Something that I personally probably would never use, but it's an interesting thing to have available to you. And some people do like slightly different types of bokeh, and being able to experiment with that is, you know, it's never a bad thing. Let's put it this way. I wouldn't want to take it off the lens because even though I personally wouldn't use it, it's an interesting thing to have on there. And a lot of people are going to find that kind of thing interesting to experiment with. Now, in terms of image quality, this is an L lens. So, you know, there's a certain amount of prestige, I suppose, that comes with being an L lens in the Canon RF range. And this absolutely lives up to that. The sharpness is fantastic, especially wide open at f2.8. The sharpness is great. Now, it does drop off a tiny bit towards the edges, but I really don't think it's enough to actually worry about. Stopping down, it also looks fantastic, which is great, because of course, with a macro lens, you probably will want to stop down a little bit to get a slightly deeper depth of field. The colors look amazing, as I'm sure you can imagine from a Canon lens. The contrast looks great. All in all, the image quality is absolutely fantastic. Whether you are shooting macro or whether you're shooting something else, whether it be portrait or landscape or something like that, really, really beautiful images coming from this lens, which is to be expected, to be honest, from an L lens. And something else you can expect from an L lens is the build quality. This is extremely well made. It feels very, very solid, but it's not too heavy. So I've got it here with the R6 and it balances pretty much perfectly with this camera. It's not so lightweight that it feels kind of cheap, but it is light enough to be completely hand-holdable, no problem at all. And certainly carry this around for an extended period of time, no problem. Otherwise, you've got the controls you'd expect. So like I mentioned before, the control ring, manual focus ring, which is really nicely weighted. And then of course this SA control, the spherical aberration control. You've then got things like the switches for extending out or reducing the autofocus distancing or the focusing distance. You've got AF, MF switch, and then the stabilization on or off. And I must say the image stabilization with this lens, especially paired with something like the R6 or the R5 or something like that, works super well. I didn't have a single problem with that, and I was able to shoot handheld reliably for moving subjects as well, which is something that can be a little bit tricky in macro. So I'm talking about things like bees, flies, things like that, without having to set some ridiculous shutter speed. I was able to shoot around 1/400th of a second handheld, and that feels pretty good, to be honest, and that's with the image stabilization on, and that does really help. Now this is rocking dual nano USM motors for the autofocus, and it makes it pretty much instantaneous, which is fantastic for macro, especially if you're trying to shoot kind of macro wildlife, flies and bees and ants and stuff like that. You do want that autofocus to just lock on instantly and be very reliable. And I'm really happy to say it absolutely is. It's extremely quick, and I relied on it completely. Now I did notice, because I did try a little bit of manual focus as well, there is a touch of focus breathing here, so a little bit of zooming in as you're focusing. I don't think it's actually the end of the world at all. It probably wouldn't matter to me, but it's worth being aware of and it's worth pointing out for a lens like this. There is a little bit of focus breathing, but again, not the end of the world. Same with vignetting. I really didn't notice almost any vignetting, but shooting wide open, there is a tiny touch of it. So again, not something that I think is worth worrying about at all, but just worth being aware of. Ultimately, I just think this is a very capable 100mm f2.8 lens. It's a fantastic macro option. So if you like shooting macro photography, or you need a macro option in your kit bag, this is going to be fantastic. It is a really, really lovely lens, both in terms of build quality and optical quality, but it does offer a lot more than just macro, which I think is good because, you know, for the kind of price point that an L lens comes in at, and there's a link in the description to go and check that out, you want probably a little bit of versatility from something like this. And I'm really happy to say this is something that would happily be in my kit bag because I would absolutely use it for portraits, landscape, product, food photography. There's loads of stuff that you could use this with on top of course, macro, which it shines at. Now, like I say, you can follow the link down in the description to go and check out the lens for yourself. There's all the pricing and all the full spec and all that kind of stuff. I have really enjoyed using this lens. I love macro photography as well. It's just a really interesting type of photography, but I'm always a big fan of a macro lens, especially when, you know, especially around that sort of 100mm focal length, just because it's so good for other stuff like portraits and loads of things, which is a really fun lens to use and a really versatile lens as well. So make sure to go and follow that link to go and check that out. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I will, of course, see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.